Welcome to Battle Tested with Tanya Acker. This is my new podcast, Battle Tested, and my guest today is MSNBC reporter Jacob Soboroff, and he has a new book out. The book is called Firestorm: The Great Los Angeles Fires and America's New Age of Disaster. It focuses on the 2025 fires that ravaged my hometown of Los Angeles. And in the book, Jacob doesn't just explore the battle that so many brave people fought to contain those fires, although he does do that in thrilling detail. Trust me, it is a real page turner. But he also talks about the personal battles that people fought as those fires ravaged the city. And even more critically, the battle for facts and information in a time of crisis when people are scared. The book is really, really good, my friends. I strongly recommend it. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jacob, and welcome to Battle Tested. Welcome to the podcast, Jacob. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to do this.
I just have to tell you, your book, Firestorm, which tells the story of the LA fires in 2025, I think I read it in like a day and a half or 2 days. It is a terrifying thriller, all the more terrifying because it's a true story, and especially terrifying for people who were here like I was. You really man, dude, that brought it back. Was that hard for you? Was it hard for you to tell this story because it's personal too?
Yeah. Yes. And, just hearing you say that, it reminds me that everyone has a story. And I know this is your pod, but now I'm so eager to hear yours. Of course. The answer is of course, and I'm going to hold you to it. And I want to hear how it was for you. How do you cover not just your hometown, the neighborhood you were born into and raised in, burning down before your eyes as you're reporting live on national television, but also your childhood home and every memory that you have about your youth, every formative memory carbonizing in real time as you have to describe to a national television audience the basics, where you are, who lives here, what's happening on the other side of town in Altadena, and an equally, if not more destructive, distinct and separate fire. And the honest truth is I could not process in real time what I was doing, even though I wanted to. I had all these questions coming into my head as I stood there, as the Palisades burned around me. How did this happen? Who's to blame? Is it going to happen again? What's out there that I don't know that's gone yet? And those are the questions and more that I asked myself that led to the process of deciding to write the book, because there's no way that I could have processed it then. And this book has allowed me the opportunity to do just that and to be in conversation just like this one to reflect on it. It really is. It was a grieving process that I hadn't even fully started, yet I was thrust into because I had to be, even though I didn't want to be.
You describe, and I will tell you my story, because that whole day.
Well, tell me now, where were you? What happened?
So I live in the Hollywood Hills.
So the Sunset Fire was probably pretty close to you.
Yes, absolutely. It certainly was. But before Palisades, and you mentioned this in your book, there was a fire not far from me, because a friend of mine had come over earlier in the day. And she's like, oh, there was a fire.
That morning, nobody remembers this. There was a fire in the Hollywood Hills the morning of January 7th. And almost all of the air assets of the fire department were allocated or whatever, dedicated to that fire early in the. So you saw that fire?
I didn't see it, but I heard about it because a friend had come by and she was like, oh my God, there were, I had my dogs out, and she was like, it was all blocked up. There was a fire. And I was exactly where I am right now, which is my home studio and office. I'm working on something. I always have the news on in the background, and I hadn't seen it. Like maybe I had national news on, I'm not sure. But that happened.
That was the start to my day too. That was the start to my day. I was watching Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and instead I get a text from my brother, and it's like, there's a big fire. So something like that happened, or what happened to you?
I found out about it from a friend who had been out hiking with dogs, and then came and told me. And then little by little, because I stayed here, I was captive to the news all day. And I had been slowly preparing to evacuate all day. Once when I saw what happened in the Palisades, which isn't super far from me. And then Jacob, and this is what became so terrifying. And in fact, part one of your book is entitled Initial Attack. And that's really what I thought. So after the Palisades happened, remember, there's a fire closer to me, then there's a fire in the Palisades, then there's a fire way to the east of me in Altadena, the Eaton fire. I actually thought it was some sort of attack. Where was your mind going as you're driving up from Orange County and hearing that this is happening? And then you learn that this fire is really taking hold in very far away parts of Los Angeles.
The thoughts going through my head were, this is going to be a once in a lifetime catastrophic event. And I had that thought after I got the text from my brother, Miles, after he told me he was evacuating the Palisades, that the fire was encroaching on the house that he was living in with his in-laws and his wife and their soon to be born daughter. And so I got up, like you, from watching the news in the bureau of NBC News. And I walk in the office of the bureau chief and I said, I got to go. And on the drive over there, by the time I got out the door, I had many colleagues already that had been dispatched. I didn't want to cover fires. It was the last thing on my mind. I sort of put it in this little compartmentalized zone of my news gathering brain that said that's a sensationalized part of the business. I had scorn for it, frankly. And boy, do I feel differently about it now. And on the drive over there around 3 or 4 o'clock, because the fire started at 10 or 10:30, I emailed Rashida Jones, who was at the time the president of NBC News, Rebecca Cutler, who is now the president of MS Now, and Greg Kordick, who ran our primetime and still does our primetime programming. And I said to them what I thought, which is, this is a once in a lifetime, if not bigger, event. Everything that I know, that I see, that I'm feeling is telling me that this is something none of us alive today have ever experienced before in Los Angeles. And I can't exactly describe to you why I'm having this gut feeling that this is going to be such a massive, life-changing natural disaster, but we got to be ready to get me on the air. And it was the night of Jimmy Carter's funeral, and it was the day after the anniversary of January 6th. And I was, at then MSNBC, now MS Now, we were in wall-to-wall political coverage. But I did the best that I could, and I called the control room of Chris Hayes' show and talked to Tina Cohn, who was the senior producer on the other end of the line. And I just said, Tina, she and I had done climate stories. I'd been to Greenland, and we had worked on stories about climate change in Southern California, one of the first stories I ever did for MSNBC, and said, you got to get me on the air sooner than they're telling me I can get on. And that's when I landed at Amalfi and Sunset in the Palisades. I could see Will Rogers State Historic Park over the ridge, and I knew that everything beyond it in the Palisades Village, because originally J.B. Rudigarama, the cameraman that I had worked with many years and I had been to Haiti with, and Alan Rice, another cameraman, we were going to go into the village. But when we got to that spot, I said to the guys over the walkie-talkie, like, we're just going to stay here because there's no way we can get in there right now. Palisades, for all intents and purposes, in my brain, I knew was gone.
It's really hard, I think, to overestimate what the impact of it was on people here, especially for those few of us, and I take great pride in this, who are from here, who are from LA, who grew up here. I grew up a bit east of you. I was born in Queen of Angels Hospital. Where were you born?
Santa Monica Hospital. Wow.
I think that this fire was a particular test of not just the city's mettle, but also its emergency preparedness and some other things, how we process facts and information and misinformation. And we'll get into some of that. But I think what was so terrifying about it and why it really hits home, like both of these fires, which took place about 45 miles apart, the Palisades, as you mentioned in your book, it's not just a community for the people who have homes there. Certainly, it's a very Tony community, but, it's a part of this Sunset Boulevard drive. Like, my husband's a car guy. That's part of our Saturday or Sunday run on the way to the beach. That's one of the best drives in all of these United States
Amen.
of America. I will just say that. And so, like, you just take that path down Sunset, you end up at the beach. And then I went back for the first time sometime, I think it was November or shortly after they finally opened up the road. And it is just devastating. And I think it is impossible. It is impossible to comprehend what these fires mean for people who lived here and who live here and who are from here. We'll go into this a little bit more later, but what do you feel our prospects are right now? And, just stick with the Palisades right now. I mean, you grew up there. Your dad ran for mayor of LA back in the day. You are
16, 17, 18 in 2001.
You're a firmly ensconced Los Angelino family. What do you think the future looks like for us?
Yeah, you're right. And the Palisades is as much a part of my DNA as is LA as my own family. And I'm so lucky to have grown up in a city where my old man was sort of in the arena and brought me around and exposed me to different parts of the city that, as you said, the Palisades is a white affluent place that's a coastal enclave, tiny little neighborhood comparatively to the size of the millions of people that live in Los Angeles. And when you look at the aftermath, not just for the Palisades, for Altadena too, because I live equidistant now between Altadena and the Palisades. And I spend more time where I was in Altadena than I did really in the Palisades in my adult life. My son had his 9th birthday at this pizza place, Side Pie, a month before the fires, and it burned down. I love Altadena just as much. And you use the word community. That's how I would describe both these places. Two places that have an incredible amount and sense of community in a city where people often knock it from the outside that it's sort of culturally devoid. And I think it's the exact opposite. There are so many cultures, beautiful, wonderful cultures and people and neighborhoods and businesses and just different ways of life that you will see around every corner in Los Angeles. And so after the costliest wildfire event in American history that burned down 16,000 structures and killed 31 people, well, the flames killed 31 people. They say maybe as many as 400 people died due to excess mortality. 3 times the size of Manhattan burned. Of course, it's going to be a hard recovery, but I think it might be even more difficult than anybody anticipated. And there's a whole host of factors, but just on the numbers, yeah, it's a tiny fraction of the 16,000 structures that have been permitted to be rebuilt. And of that, an even tinier fraction of the homes, like low double digits that have actually been rebuilt so far a year after the fire. And there's, as I said, many factors, including but not limited to very specific policy decisions that local and state and federal lawmakers have made and are continuing to make.
Rebuilding has been particularly, it's been made particularly more difficult in Altadena. It's a community that really was one of the first places in Los Angeles County where African Americans were able to buy and build homes because of redlining and other discriminatory practices. And so it really is, Altadena is a very, very special place. I want to ask you in a little bit about, I don't know if you've followed the fact that the state's currently launched a civil rights investigation into the different responses, because folks in Altadena are saying we didn't get emergency alerts early enough. We didn't get evacuation warnings.
Particularly Black residents in West Altadena. Yeah. And that's this. Rob Bonta, the Attorney General of California, as you mentioned, has opened this civil rights investigation into what in the hell happened that. And this is also part of the story about information and how hard it was to get information. Forgive me because I interrupted you.
No, please.
But the thing that you made me think of is just that both the racial disparities and socioeconomic disparities that the fire laid bare, but also how hard it was for anybody to know anything about what was actually going on. And you already mentioned it, that a lot of this was coming through text threads or local news or whatever. I don't think any elected official was a particular profile and courage in this. Local, state, federal. It was really hard to get info on what was happening. And when we did, it was not always accurate. And sometimes it was even seeded by misinformation and disinformation, including from the president-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, who was tweeting or truthing or whatever, the craziest shit during the fires that made it harder for everybody, especially the residents of West Altadena, to figure out what was going on.
Those tweets, let's just say at a moment where we were sitting here thinking that our city was literally burning down. We don't really know why. I'm serious. I was on the phone with friends and we were sure it was terrorism because I'm like, there's no way you get the Palisades, Altadena, Sunset. Like it was too much. The information that was coming from the top did not feel good, let's just say, in a time of crisis. And I want to talk to you more about that. But let's talk about what we know that was real and sure and accurate. And these are some of the forecasts that the Weather Service had generated from its computer models. They knew days before that something catastrophic was going to happen. They knew that even without knowing about the underground fire that was simmering that had been set. Someone's now in custody facing trial for starting that Lockman fire on January 1st. But before anybody knew, there was a fire smoldering underground that would ultimately, because of the conditions, result in the Palisades fire. Before anybody knew that, they knew that something bad was on the horizon.
When I met Dave Gomberg and Ariel Cohen at the National Weather Service in Oxnard, the two of the folks, federal government employees who literally issued that particularly dangerous situation warning alert days before the fire, I was blown away because I did not realize how accurately they had predicted this exact event to take place. Like you said, both in the Palisades and on the entire opposite side of the most populous county in America, Los Angeles County, in Altadena. That both the San Gabriel Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains were tinderboxes ready to go, that the hurricane force winds that were predicted to come in, all they needed was one spark, one ignition, and the results would be catastrophic. And so, as you, I think, have made the point so well, these were two totally distinct fires. There were many more that made up what I call the Great Los Angeles Fires of 2025. The Palisades fire was the holdover from the Lockman fire. There were subterranean, they were called firebrands in the root system of the chaparral in the mountains. They were unearthed, and they did ignite the mountain again. And there's all kinds of accountability questions about should there have been more firefighters there, or pre-positioning, or should they have mopped up the previous fire. But in Altadena, it was a totally different story. It was a dormant, out-of-service steel lattice tower that carried high-voltage electrical wires that, and don't ask me to explain how because I have no idea, but electrified when the windstorm hit. And nearby power lines transferred the energy to those. And that's what sparked and created the fire in Eaton Canyon that became actually the more deadly and more destructive, more gruesome Eaton fire. And yeah, we knew. I think at the end of the day, we did know. Does that mean that they could have prevented it from happening? I think when you read the book, you've read the book. When folks listening will read the book will understand my perspective on this at the end of it is I don't think there's one proximate cause of a fire like this. I think there is a confluence or a conflagration, forgive the expression, of many different factors that led to both of these unique, different, separate fires on the same day in the same county that, if it wasn't the Palisades fire, it'd be the Eaton. If it wasn't the Eaton, it'd be the Palisades, or it'll be another fire in a different place. And there will be more like it, I hate to say it, soon, not just in Los Angeles, but all throughout different parts of the country and around the world.
Well, I think that that's what's so chilling, frankly, about this story. And again, if you live here, we are not new to fire. We have a fire every year. Like we're used to fires. We're used to red flag warnings. Those things aren't unusual. This became unusual. And I'm wondering, and I know you said there's no proximate cause. I can certainly appreciate that, especially after reading your book. But is there a way that you think that this information that we had on January 3rd, January 4th, January 5th, January 6th, is there a way that you think that information could have been better used? So at least to have perhaps made this fire less destructive or to offset some of the damages? Is there something that you can pinpoint? And I know hindsight's 2020. That's not really what I'm asking. Is there a way that you think that we didn't make the best use of the information that we had at the time?
I think my answer is probably not. And I'm sure residents in Palisades and Altadena will be frustrated to hear me say that. But the reality is that this particularly dangerous situation warning was issued for almost all of LA County and the foothills of all of the major mountains in Los Angeles County. The mountain wave wind process that was predicted, which basically shunts air up and over the mountains, these Santa Anas, as Joan Didion described, the hot winds from the Northeast, blowing down and right into the communities at the bottom of these mountains, when normally that's not the way that the winds would blow. And when you have a fire, when you have a finite number of firefighters, I think that's probably a hard call to make. Again, I'm not absolving Mayor Bass or Governor Newsom or the LA County Fire Department or anybody, but how do you know exactly where to put them? Perhaps if the Lockman fire was mopped up, this wouldn't have reignited in the Palisades. Perhaps if those towers were taken down a decade ago or whenever they went out of service, you wouldn't have had the spark in Eaton Canyon. But those are bigger picture questions that extend beyond the particularly dangerous situation warning. How and when do we deploy firefighters? How can we know exactly where it's going to start? And the answer is you probably don't. In the Palisades, maybe there's more of a case for continuing investigative journalism and investigations about the fact they knew that there was a fire there and that it might not have been fully out, I still am not sure the fire wouldn't have started, or a fire wouldn't have started in that area. And that because of how hard the winds were blowing, that someone or something could have jumped on it fast enough to prevent it from exploding in the way that it did. Because as I recount in the earliest hours of the fire, and you said it reads like a sci-fi thriller. It's a minute by minute sort of TikTok of what it was like to be there. Even I didn't quite realize until I started writing the book how fast this thing blew up in both places. It was a matter of minutes from going to the spark to multiple acres to dozens of acres to hundreds of acres to thousands of acres. And so I wish I had a better answer, but I think my answer is I'm just not sure. I'm not sure. And I don't know that we will ever know for sure.
How would you, there's no proximate cause, but you can't talk like that to a lawyer. You're enticing me into something. No single proximate cause. But if you had to apportion responsibility, how would you do it?
Obviously, the person who ignited allegedly, according to federal prosecutors, and this is me as a journalist being very careful here, allegedly lit the Lockman fire would be the literal instigator of the fire that became the Palisades fire. And in Altadena, the power company, SoCal Edison, that's responsible for those towers that we are all but certain, according to the prevailing theories and the statement that they've made, electrified and caused the spark, are the two, and I don't want to use the language are to blame, but are the two, one is a person, one is an entity, that I think now that we have the hindsight, as you said, to look back at it, if not the proximate cause, perhaps the most central figures in the beginning of both of those fires. But again, without all of these other factors, I'm not certain. And I don't think anybody can ever say for sure that they wouldn't have blown up to what they did. But yeah, you're not going to have the Palisades fire without the firebrands under the surface from the Lockman fire. And you're not going to have the Eaton fire without the electrified out of service electrical towers in Eden Canyon.
In the book, you talk about a lot of the reporting that you were doing at the time. You had a number of conversations with the governor, and I think it's toward the end when you're describing some of the efforts that he intended to make in order to ease rebuilding effort, loosening regulations and the like. Have those things happened? Because rebuilding, again, as I mentioned, in some places, like you drive through the Palisades now, there is some movement, there's some happening. It still looks quite desolate, and Altadena is in an even worse state. Have these efforts to sort of loosen the red tape happened, and are they working?
What he did in the immediate aftermath was suspend CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, and the California Coastal Act to expedite building and reduce some of the environmental regulations, really landmark environmental regulations in California. And there were environmentalists who were unhappy about that. The reality is, no, nothing that anybody, I mean, the debris, both the federal government and the state government and local officials would like to take credit for the speed of the debris clearance, which was, they say, the fastest in the history of both California and the United States. But since then, nothing has seemingly expedited the speed of the recovery, because not only, as I said, it's a tiny fraction of the homes and the structures that were destroyed that have been rebuilt and are in the approval process, but people are having a hard time even deciding whether or not they want to stay. And part of the reason there is, again, multiple factors, but we live, this is no surprise to you, in the most unaffordable city and the most unaffordable state in the union. Economic inequality here is off the charts. The insurance premiums, if you've got to keep your fire insurance, are going up. The payouts are not big enough to pay for people to go back to their communities. And more often than not, people that I know have to hold down more than one job even to make do. And so in Altadena, the stats at the end of the year were, I think, 44% of the homes that were being sold to corporations, not to Californians. And in the Palisades, slightly lower at 40%. And that's just one factor. Talk about policy on a federal level, the immigration policy, which is also something I've covered for a decade at MS Now, has hampered the rebuilding too. You know, when Donald Trump says he's going after the worst of the worst, he is doing anything but, and I don't think that's a surprise to anybody that's been paying even a modicum of attention to any of this stuff. But who are they targeting in LA? Day laborers standing in Home Depot parking lots who want to engage in the rebuilding process in both the Palisades and in Altadena. And there are studies, I believe, from UCLA, the governor said this to me directly, that the labor market, if it's supposedly 40% undocumented in the construction industry, has had this massive chilling effect during the time where we need them the most in the recovery of the fires, from the fires. And that is making things increasingly more complex. That's a different type of policy. It's not the Marshall Plan 2.0 that Gavin Newsom promised and hasn't exactly materialized, at least in name. But it's an example of how what the federal government has done as well has made the rebuilding process more difficult.
Let's go back to the issue of information and how people get information when they are afraid and completely unsure of what's going on around them. There was a part in the book where you describe this family text chain that you have, because you've got family who remains in the community, and your mom on the chain sent you a drawing of your childhood home that you made when you were a kid. And you're looking at this text and you are reading, and you're looking at this picture that you drew of your house when you were a kid as you are standing in front of the charred remains of your home. I actually got chills when I read that part, Jacob. What is going through you when you are trying to be a reporter? You are covering this for MSNBC. Your mother is sending you a picture that you drew of your house that you're now looking at all burned down. What does that feel like?
Out of body is what it feels like. I've covered so many things, from the family separation crisis of the first Trump administration to the realities on the ground in Haiti after the assassination of the president, to the war in Ukraine in the first weeks of the war, to, as I mentioned, climate change in Greenland. And I mean, the things I've seen, some of them I don't wish on anybody, but going through what I went through, and I'm not saying poor me, I didn't lose any family members, I didn't lose my personal home, but what I went through, to have to process that in real time, was really difficult. It was really difficult, especially because I wanted to stay strong and project, as a resident or former resident of the Palisades, the beautiful stuff about our community to the people who are watching all around the country and around the world. And I felt lost, is how I felt. I felt lost. I felt alienated. I felt at times insecure. And not until I went through this year-long process of writing and putting out this book did I start to feel more connected again, grounded. I didn't feel grounded. The short answer is, if I was better at this, the short answer is I didn't feel like I had my feet on the ground. And I didn't feel grounded, actually, until I was able to go through this, talk to other people who went through it, learn about the experiences of other people, whether it was the meteorologists that you mentioned, or the firefighters, or the wildlife biologists, or other government employees who, when you put all the stories together, you realize you're in community with other people, because what it feels like is extremely isolating and extremely alone. And that's how I felt during those moments.
And isolation, I think that was probably exacerbated by a lot of the information that was being promoted and circulated. You write in the book Firestorm about then President-elect Trump's response, which I'll be kind, was at times just unkind. And perhaps kindness is more than one should hope for under those circumstances. But when you're watching your city burn down from unknown causes, the tone was, again, not unanticipated. I don't think that the president's made any secret of who he is and how he communicates, but it was easier to feel, I think, a little bit adrift, because you're kind of like, what's going to happen? Like, who's going to be there? Your business is separating truth from fiction, right? Like, that is your whole reason for being. That is what you do. At a time like that, when people are so afraid, it's harder than ever, I think, to sort of separate fact from fiction, which is why so many rumors did proliferate in the way that they did. So when the next catastrophe happens, how do we do better? Because there are still rumors that are flying around about the causes of the fires, about there's no water, there's no way to get the water. I don't think we have time to dissect all of these various theories, but the next time this happens, and there will be a next time, what should people do in order to sort of, try to have a way to find a way to some facts when you don't know who, like what leader of what state or what country, maybe ours, might be posting like whatever. Like, how do people find some grounding in a type of crisis like that?
It's such a good question. And I think that the answer is you have to find and know the sources you trust, identify them and stick to them, because this was the fire of the future. And that's what a senior level emergency management official told me in Washington, and sort of a clandestine meeting that we had. He wasn't supposed to speak out about this, but he met and we talked about it anyway. And part of the fire of the future is not just climate change. It's not just changes in the way we live. All these electric car batteries were exploding. It's not just our infrastructure is falling apart. And that might be, as you mentioned, the reservoir in the Palisades or the electrical equipment in Altadena, but the politics of blame and misinformation and disinformation. And when you've got Donald Trump tweeting about a mystical tap that's going to open up and what, I don't mean to laugh, it's so crazy. Water's going to flow down from the Pacific Northwest and the Delta smelt tiny little fish is responsible for the fire. Even you can't not laugh. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And Elon Musk is there telling these firefighters about the pressure and the conspiracy theories. And they're like, no, sir, we're just flowing too much water. What do you do? And the answer I think that I have, and by the way, updates from Mayor Bass, who was in Ghana and came back, were not always the best source of information. The updates from any of the elected officials on the ground felt hard to come by and hard to find. People turned to Watch Duty and to Genesis Protect, these apps to figure out where the fire was burning.
I was all over the Watch Duty.
I'm telling you, everybody was.
Hands down for Watch Duty.
They were amazing. But I think that the answer for me, and I think definitionally the people who I felt performed the biggest public service when it comes to delivering accurate information, was the local news. Not us in the national media, but the radio reporters, the LA Times, the local print media, small on-the-ground independent journalism organizations, and local broadcast news. You would know what was happening on the street level. KNBC, for instance, as I write in the book, was on the air for, I think, 60 or 61 hours straight from the beginning of the Palisades fire until they decided to take their first commercial break. And they had reporters dispatched all throughout the city that were literally saying, on this street, in this neighborhood, in this part of the Palisades or this part of Altadena, that house is still there, that house is not, this neighbor is there, and this is what they want their loved one that's watching to know. And if there has ever been a case for local journalism, it is in a big mass casualty crisis like this one. And as far as information goes, I think they were the most reliable narrator, distributor of information of anybody. And as you said, man, I am in awe of my colleagues in the local media and the way that they kept us informed, because otherwise it was up to text threads and it was up to apps and it was up to whatever you might catch on whatever briefing they were doing at different times on different days. It felt impossible to understand what was going on, actually. And the president-elect was sending out cuckoo messages all day long about the reasons that he thought that the fire was happening and how he was somehow going to save it. And by the way, incidentally, once he became president, he quote unquote opened the tap, which was actually just flooding the Central Valley. That has nothing to do with LA, with 2.5 billion gallons of water, flooding some of the farms of the people he supports and doing nothing for the people of Los Angeles. So that's to square that circle. That's what happened there.
We're laughing, but it's not. I mean, I was going to say it's darkly comic, but it's just dark, actually, if you think about it, because people read that, and there were a lot of people who thought that there was some magical tap that Gavin Newsom was just deciding to keep closed because Gavin Newsom, or what did Trump
is in love with a tiny fish.
Yeah,
it is the craziest shit you can possibly.
It's all about the smelt that we put on top of sushi sometimes, right?
Ridiculous.
If it's even that good. I mean, it was
ridiculous.
What was the most? I mean, that was one that was particularly devastating. Like, is there another? When you think about some of these things that were being posted, when you think about some of Elon Musk's retweets, is there something that stands out other than the magical tap, which subsequently flooded, as you point out, and also talk about in the book, the Central Valley, which was not burned? Is there another untruth that really, I'm being so polite. Why am I saying untruth? Is there another big lie
There you go.
that you think was particularly damaging and that, we're still having to debunk even now as we try to move forward with rebuilding?
Some of these people on the far right were accusing DEI of causing the fires, saying that that's why the fire chief of Los Angeles, Kristen Crowley, was hired, who was the then fire chief. The level of despicable political posturing around the fires seemed sort of never ending, especially in the social media ecosystem. And it's why I actually included that story in the book about Stephen Miller's wife, Katie.
I mean, there's so many surreal things that are taking place. And just to provide some context, because we're talking about right now, we're talking about untruths, misinformation that's being promoted by Donald Trump, the then president-elect of the United States.
Elon Musk, the incoming head of Doge.
And Elon Musk, who's coming in to fix the government, is retweeting. I think at one point, this was also in the book.
Alex Jones.
He's retweeting Alex Jones, who thought that Sandy Hook was a big scam and ended up having to pay a lot of money if the verdict was ever even paid, but got sued and was found liable for spreading lies. So Elon Musk is retweeting him. The president-elect is coming up with his theories about taps and how bad Gavin Newsom is. Meanwhile, the president's right hand, Stephen Miller, his wife, Katie Miller, is calling you for information about the fire and what's happening to Miller's parents' home. Now, you just have to tell that story because irony is real.
Stranger than fiction, as they say. Katie Miller and I knew Katie Miller as Katie Waldman. She was the junior most press deputy at the Department of Homeland Security when I was covering family separation. She worked for Kirstjen Nielsen at the time. And she invited me inside the detention centers to see family separation for myself. We had a professional journalist-source relationship. It's how I wrote my first book and how I covered family separations for MSNBC. I was able to see it with my own eyes, and I was grateful to her for that. And when I published Separated, some of the things that Katie had said in the book were not particularly nice. If you want to know what I think about them, about how she felt about the children that she was ripping apart from their mothers and their fathers. And so she cut off communication with me, and we didn't talk, feels like for years. And as I stood there getting ready to deliver a special report for Lester Holt, my phone rang. I picked it up. She said, "Hi, it's Katie Miller." And I said, "Hi, Katie. I got to call you back." I hung up. Before I could pick up the phone, in my pocket, the phone's buzzing. I pull the phone out of my pocket and it says an address and it says Stephen's parents' house. Can you go check on it? And I said to myself in my head, because I'm standing there with my mic open, ready to go on TV with Lester Holt, am I about to? First, I think I said, what the fuck? And then I said, am I about to go to Stephen Miller's parents' house? Whoa. But it took me less than half a second to think, of course I'm going to. Just like I went for my brother, just like I went for my high school carpool mate, Jake Levine, just like I've gone for other people who have contacted me. Katie went on to say, you're the only person we know that's in the Palisades, and essentially we could use your help. What was I going to do? So I drove over there, and the house had burned down, and I sent Katie a picture of the house, and I said, the Palisades is stronger than politics, and I sent a red heart emoji. And literally minutes later, I discovered all the things we've been talking about. The conspiracy theories Trump was putting forward, the misinformation and disinformation from Elon Musk, all of it. And more than anything, it was sad for me. I was devastated for the Millers, just like I was devastated for everybody in the Palisades. I felt like a pit in my stomach for them. But then I thought, the crap that these people are spreading, making people have a harder time understanding what's going on, not in just the aftermath, but in the actual fire itself, is hurting Stephen Miller's parents, Katie Miller's in-laws, as much as it is hurting anybody else. And as you said, the irony of it was too thick to not include in this book. And it was sort of my duty as a journalist to say, this type of misinformation and disinformation hurts everyone, even if it comes from just one political party. And the story about Katie Miller and Stephen Miller is evidence of that. And so that's why I ultimately put it in the book. And by the way, she wasn't thrilled that it was in this book either.
I find it, there is something to be noted in the fact that one can simultaneously defend misinformation and double down on misinformation. But when they want actual information, they're reaching out to a member of the much maligned fake
Fake
news,
news. Yeah.
MSNBC, because I don't think that I don't think you're a favorite of Carolyn Levitt's in this White House. I'm just going to go out on a limb and like say that.
I can confirm that.
The Palisades is bigger than politics. What happened in Altadena is bigger than politics in a way. We should point out, as you do in Firestorm, that when President Trump came to visit the fires and went to the Palisades, he did not go to Altadena.
No,
and I think that community has been sort of much neglected in a part of this, in a part of the broader conversation.
Absolutely.
But we're a little over a year out now. And I think people like you and me who are from this town and know it will come back and know that there's no fire that's gonna keep us out of commission. You know, I finally, just sort of circling back, you know, we've done that drive now a few times since they reopened PCH, and it's still devastating. I think the city will come back because it is LA. Do you think that folks have kind of gotten the memo? I mean, I think that there was such a reaction to so many of the lies and the misinformation that was being promoted that people could really kind of double down and get really defensive in that, instead of taking a step back even further and kind of pinpointing the things that we have to do to move the city forward. Are we really doing that, or are we still sort of locked in debunking lies and misinformation?
No, if anybody's doing it, it's the people of Los Angeles. And that's what actually, for me, in the end, this is a hopeful book and a hopeful story. And I love my job because I get to spend so much time with ordinary folks. And when you read this book, you're going to see it's a book. When our listeners read the book, they're going to see that this is a book about people as much as it is about politics and about climate change. And whether it is the firefighters, Eric Mendoza or Tim Larson from the Palisades, or Jake Torres, Gunnar Alves, Jonathan Sweeney from Altadena, or, as we mentioned, Dave Gomberg and Ariel Cohen from the National Weather Service, or Herb and Lloyda Wilson, these two UPS employees who for 36 years worked there and met and fell in love and lived on McNally Avenue in Altadena, or Kate Hennigan, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory engineer who, along with hundreds of her colleagues, lost their homes in the fire. The list goes on and on and on. Albino Fuentes, one of my favorite humans on earth, who worked at Cafe Vita in Pacific Palisades, and to me is as important as any person who lays their head in the Palisades at night. I get extraordinary hope from their stories and how they've managed to make their way through the fire, because they all did lose everything. Even the firefighters, who felt like, despite their best efforts, they failed. And the fact that they're all still going in the face of so many challenges, including potential health challenges for the firefighters. Herb and Lloyda have had to move 10 times since the fire as they've tried to figure out what they're going to do as they rebuild their house. They're still going. And they're not going to take no for an answer. And everybody knows there'll be more fires like this. It's why in the 60s there was a doc called Design for Disaster about the Bel Air fire that was made by the fire department in LA, essentially saying, the way we live in a place like this is designed for fires like this to happen. And sure enough, it happened and will happen again. But in the same way that I have seen people out on the streets in my day job pushing back against the ICE raids all across the country, hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions in the streets, that have forced the president to a policy reversal, it is the people of LA who I believe are going to, through being in community, get us through what is the worst natural disaster that we have ever experienced. And in a way, it was the big one that we have all, you and I, growing up in LA, trained for and practiced for. We thought it was going to be an earthquake, but it turned out to be a devastating wildfire. And so I think that's what's allowing me to see what is around the corner, is the extraordinary people of this place and how we've all been able to relate to one another after something like this happened.
The Santa Ynez reservoir, it was empty. And I think a lot of people have pointed to that as an example of state unpreparedness or ill preparedness with respect to these fires. How should we interpret that?
Everything that I've talked to, when you hear from what the civil engineers have had to say or the firefighters themselves, this 117 million gallon reservoir that actually it's an LA City reservoir in the Palisades Highlands, which is very close to where the fire started. The fact that it was empty likely couldn't have stopped the fire once it got going. Would it have resulted in maybe some more pressure in the hydrants for a certain amount of time and resulted in some more structure saved? It's possible, but the amount of water that was flowing just generally, to put in perspective, we also ran out, the hydrants also went to low to no pressure in Altadena, and they didn't have an empty reservoir that was 117 million gallons. We were, meaning the firefighters of both LA City and LA County and all the mutual aid firefighters that came to town, were flowing so much water. The analogy people tell me is it's like turning on every tap in your house at the same time and expecting you're going to have killer water pressure throughout your whole house. It doesn't work that way. And so that's what was happening in Los Angeles. I'm not saying that were that reservoir full, perhaps there wouldn't have been slightly different pressure at different times in different hydrants, but would it have stopped the fire? Every expert that I have talked to have said, no, likely not. But why was it empty? Why did it take so long? That's all about bureaucratic red tape and a municipal government. And those are questions that are, I think, worth asking.
What are folks in the sort of local Palisades community? What's their reaction to the extent you feel comfortable opining as to it about Rick Caruso being able to save his Palisades Village, which is not, again, you point out this distinction in the book, and people who are from LA know the difference between the Caruso Mall and then the older village that's a part of the community. Were people, I don't know, how did people feel about that? Were they like, could he have spared a few extra firefighters for my house? I mean, is there a resentment? Is there,
right?
Yeah,
this is a billionaire, Rick Caruso, who has all these shopping centers in LA, the Grove and the Americana and this Palisades Village. And for me, I think he's beloved by a lot of people in the Palisades. And I think he's a divisive figure for many others. And his development never represented the Palisades that I knew when I grew up there. It made it feel more like a mall than a small town to me. This is just my personal opinion. Also, my personal opinion is that the story of Rick Caruso saving his shopping center with his private firefighting force is the story that I describe all throughout Los Angeles of the gap between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the income inequality. He could afford to have his own private firefighters. And would I do the same if I was a billionaire with a shopping center that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars? Maybe, I don't know. But it just goes to show that it was one of the most striking things to me when I drove through the Palisades at 3 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning on January 8th, the morning after the fire started. And I saw everything was gone except for his shopping center. It didn't feel good. It didn't feel good to see. But do I think that there are people in the Palisades and maybe elsewhere in the city that look at that and say, well, that's managerial competence. We want a guy like that who knows how to save his own thing, and maybe he could have saved the city. Fair enough. I think that's sort of a political opinion, and people will have different ones. But what I can tell you is, obviously, the obvious facts on the ground about that are the man had the resources to employ his own private firefighters, and across the street, many, if not all, of the buildings burned down. And you make of that what you want to make of it. I think for me, it shows that a guy with a lot of money was able to save his multi-$100 million shopping center in a community where not everybody was as lucky.
I think it's also important to emphasize what you said, like, not a billionaire, don't have a shopping center. I am not saying right now that I wouldn't have done exactly the same thing, or I wouldn't have tried to look after my own resources. I don't think that the issue is sort of indicting what he did. It's just, it's sort of interesting for me to sort of process how people in that community are seeing it. It's a hard time to be a journalist right now, Jacob. What's keeping you up at night?
Well, I've been covering immigration so closely in addition to covering the fires, and what I have seen take place across the country, whether it was here in LA in June, or Chicago in October, or the hallways of 26 Federal Plaza in New York City over the summer, or in Charlotte, North Carolina, or most recently in Minneapolis, all these places that I have been, on the surface, it's a story about immigration and a story about what this administration is doing to people who they say are the worst of the worst, but as I said to you before, are anything but. There are neighbors and fellow parishioners and classmates and coworkers and friends. And it's actually not a story about immigration any longer. It's a story about our country and whether or not we're going to have the freedoms to have free and fair elections in this nation come the midterm elections. That's what's keeping me up at night. This is about what potentially could be sort of an existential crisis when it comes to our democracy. And I used to not talk this way. I remember I had an event with Rachel Maddow here for her book Prequel a couple years ago, and she said something of that nature. And I think I said, do you really mean that? And she looked at me like I was nuts. But she was absolutely right. I'm worried about what's going to happen in and around the midterms. And I say that as a journalist that is basing my observations on the facts on the ground that I have seen in all of these cities in the first year of this second Trump administration. And so that's why I have the same faith that I mentioned to you about the people of the country to go vote. They're going to vote for whoever they want, but go and vote. It's why I love my job and my proximity to real people and to be able to go out there and see things with my own eyes. And why ultimately in a challenging environment as a reporter, I feel pretty hopeful though about what the future portends, so long as people stay engaged. And that's the number one thing, is that when you look away is when bad stuff happens.
I think that the main point of revisiting a lot of the bad stuff is to try to anticipate and mitigate the next bad thing that happens. So you're worried about the midterms. That's keeping you up at night. You mentioned things on the ground that you are seeing. What are you seeing that has you particularly alarmed? And be specific.
Well, I can tell you, I stood face to face with Marine Corps troops in the city of LA, or National Guard troops. I've seen masked, heavily armed federal agents in all of those cities that I told you I've been in over the course of the last year. I've seen people taken indiscriminately from their vehicles, from their homes, from routine check-ins at immigration check-ins where they're trying to do the right thing. That stuff is scary. And it's not scary to me as a white dude from the Palisades in terms of being taken myself. And, now that I say that, even look, 2 American citizens, Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, were also killed. It's scary to me because we have a constitution. I'm talking to a lawyer. We have a constitution for a reason and protections for a reason. And when they seem to be indiscriminately violated without any repercussions for the people doing them, where's the accountability, was a question that we talked about before. That is challenging, both as a journalist trying to figure out how to cover it, but also for our fellow American citizens and non-citizens alike. And so it's a time to be vigilant. And and I think that's why I'm particularly grateful to be in this job at this time, is that I'm happy to be engaged in this project, whatever it is, while we still have these rights.
I think that this country, much like our beloved city, it's been through some stuff. There have been challenges to democracy, to making sure that all of us have our voices heard since the country started. And like you, I have to believe that we'll come through them, because Los Angelenos are a determined people, as are Americans. And I am so grateful to you, Jacob, not just for your time today, but also for being one of those voices out there in a much maligned profession. You may not have a lot of friends or people giving you your flowers these days, but there are so many people, including Katie Miller, who are coming to you and relying on you for good, real information. And, thank you for doing that, because it's harder than ever. I mean, there are so many people who are like calling themselves journalists, and they really wouldn't know like a lie from the truth, or actually they might know, they just don't care.
I still have the imposter syndrome, whether or not I am either. But thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
It's great to have folks like you who are paying attention to facts and sharing them with us. And thanks again for sharing your story, both personal and also the stories of really the many, many heroes who brought us through these 2025 fires. Your book is Firestorm. People, you should read it. Like, I'm sure it's going to be optioned. It's going to be, I don't know if I'm not ready to watch that movie yet when it happens, but I think it's just such a powerful story. You talk about systems, you talk about people, and you talk about real courage in this book. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Very kind. Thank you for having me, and it's my honor to do this again.